Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
A lot of secular universities are teaching religion by using film, partly because they're having trouble filling the courses. People aren't interested in religion anymore. So I use that same argument from Jacques Derrida that the only religion we should take seriously is a religion based on love, which avoids an economy of exchange. Look at this. Christianity is the only religion that does that. So in this book that's being studied at secular universities, I am basically arguing why Christianity should be taken more seriously than any other religion.
Hello and welcome to the new year. I'm here with Dr. Crystal Downing and with Reverend Aaron Hill to discuss Crystal's inaugural lecture on Dorothy Sayers. These inaugural lectures, Crystal and I are co-directors of the Wade Center, and we're also co-holders of the Marion E. Wade Chair of Christian Thought. And as co-holders of the chair, we each will give an inaugural lecture. Crystal's was last March, and we want to talk to her today about some of her ideas that she's been discovering about Dorothy Sayers in film.
Thank you, David, for inviting me here today.
Yes, thank you for coming from the other side of the room to the microphone. And Aaron, thank you for sitting in as guest interrogator, investigator.
Yes, you're very welcome.
Facilitator.
Yes.
Well, one of the reasons I'm interested in Dorothy Sayers in film, and I'm halfway through a book project exploring what Sayers can teach us about film, is an important concern for contemporary Christians to consider. Many younger generations are much more influenced by visual media than by books. People are not reading books as much as they once used to. So we need to think about how can we be intelligent screeners of film in ways that gets us thinking about the important issues of existence today.
Okay, can we go back a step and talk about how you developed your interest in Dorothy Sayers in the first place?
I was intrigued by this place called the Wade Center that had 6 important influences on the great C.S. Lewis, whose work I appreciated. And I was very fascinated about the one woman in the ranks of the 6. I wanted to know more about her, especially being a woman living at a time when women were not valued for their intellectual and theological insight. And so I just decided I'm going to start studying Dorothy L. Sayers. And I came to the Wade in the 1990s when I was a professor at a Christian college in Pennsylvania and just started reading.
So, Crystal, I have a question for you. Tell us a little bit about your background. What have you worked on besides Sayers? What is your foundation, and sort of where are you coming at, the perspective you're coming from when you're looking at Dorothy Sayers?
Well, my first book was on Dorothy Sayers, but what fascinated me is how she was incredibly insightful about the problematics of language, how no knowledge is innocent. And I saw that she recognized or anticipated postmodern theory by decades. And this was just a sign of her brilliance. Postmodernism, of course, is called the religious turn in philosophy. It is the movement away from a type of skepticism that said all religious vocabularies are superstitious, we can't trust them. And postmodern theory was exploring how all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, has to be taken on faith. And this is something that Sayers was saying in the 1940s and 50s before the first postmodern texts were being advanced in the late 1960s. So I wanted to explore that. I am a theory wonk and just wrote this book showing her brilliance and how it paralleled great thinkers like Jacques Derrida and Richard Rorty and Mikhail Bakhtin, especially, who has been celebrated by postmodern thinkers and himself was a Christian challenging modernist paradigms. In fact, got sent to Siberia because he was a Christian in the USSR under Stalin. And they have a lot of insights as Christians in common that would be very welcomed by postmodern theory. So after I did that book on Sayers, then I thought, okay, I want to write a more popular book about how postmodern theory is important for Christians. And that was my second book. And I use quotations from both C.S. Lewis and Sayers to show how their insight is consonant with postmodern theory. And then my third book...
Give the title of your second book.
The second book is How Postmodernism Serves My Faith.
Because most people, when they hear postmodernism, they think relativism, nothing means
Right.
anything.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
that's
the
because
enemy of faith.
they
Right.
know nothing about it.
Can
word
you explain...
postmodernism has become a pariah, but as I say, it essentially is this recognition that human thought is not progressing to greater and greater insight, which is a very modernist assumption that we've left behind the superstitions of religion and we are now more and more enlightened. And postmodern theorists started calling that into question, showing that, for instance, Michel Foucault, he wrote something called The Archaeology of Knowledge, showing that in different eras, people thought in different ways and thinking is shaped by the language we use. And so rather than progressing, he said, no, it's like an archaeological dig where some earlier cultures actually had much more sophisticated explanations of reality than later cultures. And so he totally undermined the modernist progressivism. And then this is what other postmodern theorists built upon, saying that our thinking is shaped by the language we use. And there is especially interesting quotation by Jacques Derrida, who is called the father of deconstruction. And he says that in the beginning was the Word. And what's fascinating about postmodern theorists is they became, at least three of them, Derrida, Lyotard, and I think Lacan, all became fascinated by Augustine because they saw that Augustine, the great definer of Christianity in the 5th century, was saying things very similar to what they were saying. And Augustine's On Christian Doctrine is exploring how language shapes the way we perceive reality. And so as I came to that understanding, I wanted to look at language theory that anticipated postmodern theories. It's called semiotics. And so my third book was on semiotic theory. I talk much more about Augustine and other Christians who are considered some of the earliest semioticians. But once again, I'm using Sayers and Lewis as exemplars of how our understanding is inevitably situated in the language we use. And that's why it's very important for Christians to be thinking about how they use language, which is the point of my third book. It's called Changing Signs of Truth. We change the way people understand Christianity by changing the language. Just an obvious example is what had happened to the word indulgences. This was a profound theological term for the Christian church that had turned into the buying and selling of indulgence papers that led to the Protestant Reformation. Indulgence just means that God indulges us by offering us grace through the death and resurrection of Jesus. But that word itself turned into this vile practice. So,
explain real quickly for the folks out there in podcast land. Indulgences, the church was selling them if you had a loved one in purgatory.
right,
That you could shorten their
time
their
in
term in
purgatory,
purgatory
by
by
buying
right.
an indulgence paper. So the word indulgence went from meaning God's grace, a totally free gift that you don't earn, to something that was literally being bought and sold. And so if someone were to suggest, no, we have to hold on to that word indulgence because this word has been used for 500 years to talk about Christianity, that is a naive position. So language gets tainted by the culture in which it is used.
Well,
So-
tell me what you think of this story. This is the postmodern theorist, and he says, we have no access to absolute truth. All we can do is create sophisticated systems by which we try to approximate the truth. And 3 people in the front row in the audience jump up. One of them says, I'm a Christian and I believe I do have access to absolute truth. And the Muslim says, I'm a Muslim and I believe I have access to absolute truth. And then the scientific materialist says, I'm a scientific materialist and I believe I have access to scientific truth. And the postmodern speaker says, thank you, gentlemen. You just illustrated my point. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that story?
Well, I like it. And what I find...
Let the record show that Dr. Downing liked that story.
Well, but that doesn't mean the truth isn't out there. And this is postmodern theorists would acknowledge the fact that truth is out there, but we all see the truth through the lens of our particular religious vocabularies. And they're saying that scientism is as much a religious vocabulary as is Christianity. And so what was wonderful about this movement is it allowed Christians onto the stage of conversation.
Yeah, because a big turn in the academy was this idea that they had access to this sort of, absolute truth through science and experimentation and observation, and here Christians are, and they're just sort of putting their faith in something that they can't
They're just
ultimately
superstitious.
prove. Yeah,
Right.
and so I think most people assume that, like you said, David, postmodernism is this sort of undermining of absolute truth, when in reality it was sort of undermining a lot of the overblown claims of science and the
that said only
Enlightenment.
we can get you truth. In fact, there's a famous literary critic that both C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers talk about, I.A. Richards, who explicitly said, he wrote a book called Science and Poetry, and he said, science and science only, and he denounces Christian vocabularies, and he says, science brings us truth, poetry brings us meaning. You don't need Christianity for either truth or meaning.
Yeah.
And so he was writing in the 1920s. He's a classic example of this modernist dismissal of Christianity.
Gotcha.
And postmodernism allowed Christians to be part of the conversation. And as I was writing my book on postmodernism, my colleagues at Messiah College, a Christian college in Pennsylvania, were saying it explains a difference they noticed at their professional conferences. All of a sudden, their colleagues from Ivy League universities were starting to talk about Christianity and politics, Christianity and sociology, and Christianity and literature. Whereas at the height of modernism, they would never even put the word Christianity in a program for 10,000 people at an international conference.
Yeah.
So there was a radical change. And I actually go so far as saying that postmodernism is probably the best thing that happened to Christianity in 300 years. And my book explains why.
Well, you'll have to read the book to get the whole story. Let me ask you one more question before I move on. How is this, because I think postmodernism is often associated with pluralism, which I think is a sort of a fear that a lot of Christians in America, and is a target of apologetics and things like that. And so by getting associated with pluralism, it's this idea that, well, because we don't have access to this absolute truth, therefore there sort of is no truth. Whatever truth is unique to you is your truth, and there is no sort of higher truth. How does that relate to this, or does it at all? Because I
Oh.
think that's a common
Yes.
association
And
that
that is
most
a
Christians
very
have.
important question. And in fact, I address it in my book about Dorothy Sayers that's going to be coming out next fall.
Oh,
It's
teaser.
called Subversive Christ Culture and the Shocking Dorothy Sayers. And so I'm getting more into theological issues like that. And what I'm showing is how Sayers recognized, I mean, she, like C.S. Lewis, believed that Christianity was the truth about God's creation. But how can you justify that when there are all these other plural explanations? And what she would say, and what I would say, is that Christianity distinguishes itself from all other explanations of truth by avoiding what the famous deconstructionist Jacques Derrida called an economy of exchange. Almost all religions are exchangeist.
Exchangeist.
Involve
yes.
exchange.
Yeah, involve exchange. Yeah. You do this, you get salvation. You go through this ritual, you're saved from the sins. You buy indulgence papers, you get through purgatory. And even evangelicals can sometimes reduce Christianity to an economy of exchange where they would say, you have to say this particular prayer and you get into heaven. And they are forgetting that what distinguishes Christianity from, I would say, all other religions I'm aware of is that salvation is a gift. You do nothing to get it in exchange.
Merit it.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is not merited. It is not earned. It is not purchased. And something that distinguishes one religion from all other religions we should take seriously, especially the fact that since none of us have unmediated access to the truth, we all see the truth through the lens of our religious discourse. Christianity argues that because we don't have unmediated access, God took on flesh and came down to be with us. And God appeared in the flesh in the discourse of first century Israel, and Jesus dressed, because he was human, as the people at that time. Jesus used metaphors that made sense to people at that time.
He did not speak English.
He did not speak English. He did not dress in a three-piece suit, even though many Christians today want to dress Jesus in our own thoughts.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that this, again, two now distinctives of Christianity. It's not based on an economy of exchange. And because that, God saw the need to come in the flesh to communicate God's own self to us. And hallelujah.
Yeah.
So we need to think then very carefully about the language that we use, realize that language itself, unlike God, is culturally constructed.
Yeah.
And isn't that fascinating in Genesis that it shows not that God gave humans the language they were supposed to speak, but God had Adam and Eve name the animals, as though to say, this is a human construction.
Yeah.
So then that led to my third book, exploring, as I said, this whole issue. And I talk about how semiotic theory, which is a theory of signs, anytime in the New Testament we're told that, well, like the word, this shall be a sign for you. You shall find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a manger. The word sign is the Greek semeion, and that is where we get the word semiotics.
So
Same
what's
as
the
signs and wonders? That's also the same
Yeah.
word, right?
so what's the
Well,
difference?
wonders is a different word.
Yeah,
Yeah,
signs.
signs.
What's
Yeah.
the difference between a sign and a symbol or a concept?
Oh, wow. Well, I wrote a whole 300-page book about that. There are different theories about signs. What's fascinating is that the person who coined the word semiotics, Charles Sanders Peirce, had a mystical experience in an Episcopal church in New York City. And he came to believe that the universe was created by a trinity. But before he had that mystical experience, he came up with a theory of the sign that is triadic, that all signs operate in a Trinitarian way. So he just felt language itself now is proving the truth of Christianity.
Yeah.
And once again, the idea that God's own self is plural. God is Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And hence, that's why we can say God is love, because God, Father, Son, Holy Ghost in constant relationship.
Yeah.
So love is inherent to God's nature, and the very signs we use reflect God's nature. Signs themselves, according to Charles Sanders Peirce. And again, this can be helpful to Christians, although Peirce is so hard to understand, as you can imagine. How do you explain sign theory? And there are 100,000 pages of Peirce's notes at Harvard University. Peirce himself described it as a snarl of twine. And this was the hardest project I ever engaged in, is reading Peirce and trying to make him understandable to Christians.
Can I jump in a second? He said signs were triadic. What was the triad? Usually you talk about the signifier and the signified.
Okay. That was the structuralist view of the sign initiated by Ferdinand de Saussure. And he saw everything in binaries. So you have signifier and signified. You have a paro, which is an individual word, which is always embedded in long, which is a particular language system. I mean, I could go on and on. In fact, people talk about Saussure's insistent binaryism. And the trouble with binaries is it reduces thought to either or categories. It's either a signifier or it's the signified. It's either long or pro.
Yeah.
And here is another distinctive of Christianity that, for me, reinforces why it is true that Jesus Christ refuses binary thinking, because Jesus Christ is both and. Jesus is both fully God and fully human. And this is something that we as Christians need to be emphasizing, that we worship a Jesus who is both fully God, fully human. We need to be operating according to both and thought, rather than reducing everything to binaries. And the whole polarization in our country now is due to binary thinking. It's I'm right, you're wrong, or vice versa, rather than seeing the complexity of
that truth and falsehood may exist on both sides.
Of course. So, and I think the most sophisticated thinkers realize that things can't be simplistically reduced to either or categories.
The Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam that says, "All faith is true, all faith is false. Truth is a shattered mirror strown, and each believes his shard the whole to own."
Wow, how'd you remember that?
Because when I was in college, I was struggling with truth, and I read that, and I said, wow.
Wow. Yeah, that's good. You've never recited that to me before. Anyway.
Aw, tender moment on the podcast.
Tender moment.
Yes.
We can hold hands. The listeners can't see this. I wanted to go back to cultural construction. A lot of people think that sounds very subjective. But when I had a student who saw the title, I heard the owl call my name, and she said, "Oh, is that about wisdom?" Because in our culture, owls you associate with wisdom. And I said, no, it's actually about death in Indian culture. And she was sort of surprised. She thought there was something universal about that sign, that an owl means wisdom.
Yeah.
And so a lot of our signs, we don't realize how culturally constructed they are. Even when
Well-
you say God the Father or God the King, that means something very different to different cultures and different people.
Right.
Even things like colors and
Right.
ordinal directions
Right.
and
Right.
so many things that we think are universal don't necessarily translate across cultures.
Right.
Well, and this is one of the reasons my book, Changing Signs of Truth, is being taught in seminaries, because if you're going to witness to the distinctive truth of Christianity, you have to be cognizant not only of the signs we use, but the way the people you are communicating to interpret signs. And so sign theory is essential for missionaries.
For translating the gospel
Yeah,
into different
that's
cultures.
right. That's right. One of Wheaton College's graduates, who my mother knew when she was here at Wheaton, Elizabeth Elliott, she talks about this when after her husband was killed by the Auca Indians, and her recognition that missions are when missionaries just try to impose English speakers' signs onto other cultures, they're not getting through. They're just saying, you've got to think the way I think. Once again, it's like saying Jesus dressed the way we do in the 20th century.
But often it's unconscious because we don't realize that we're embedded. Charles
right.
Kraft tells the story in Christianity and Culture. He was speaking to some African tribal leaders, and he was giving them the story of Joseph. And he says his brothers, sold him into slavery, and he was in prison. But then he was able to interpret dreams. And later on, when they needed food because they were having terrible famine, they went to Egypt, and there's Joseph set up as a very important ruler. And he told the whole story the way we've all heard it in Sunday school. And he says, what's the important truth that we learn from this story? And for American Christians, it tends to be faithfulness. Just hang in there, be patient, trust God. Things will take a turn. Eventually, you will be. The wheel of fortune will turn in your favor. So he said, "What's the story of Joseph all about?" And the tribal leaders all agreed. The point is, don't betray your kindred. It'll come back to haunt you. And he realized that the Hebrews were much closer to these African tribes than they were to us.
Right.
And there was a whole lesson there of don't betray your kindred that had never occurred to him.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that happens a lot in cross-cultural communication.
Right.
Yeah.
Even when we read the Bible, we impose our language paradigms on our understanding of the Bible. Former professor here at Wheaton College, who's now on the Wade Center board, Dr. Mark Knoll, has written a fantastic book about attitudes towards slavery among 19th century Christians. And he shows that even Christians in the North were using the Bible to support the idea of slavery. And there's plenty of verses in the Bible that can support slavery.
It would be taken out of context too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And, you proof text and pick these verses out. And so abolitionists were called unbiblical because abolition isn't in the Bible, whereas slavery is in the Bible.
Yeah.
So obviously, these Christians were reading the Bible through the lens of culturally constructed attitudes of their time.
Yeah.
So we as Christians have to be aware of how we are embedded in language.
Yeah.
And the trouble is when you're embedded in it, it's impossible to rise above it.
Yeah. It's like turning around and looking at yourself.
Yeah.
It's
But
impossible.
Sayers, or actually Bakhtin, I talk about this in my Sayers book. He talks about this idea. It's like looking at the back of your head.
Yeah.
You cannot see the back of your head.
Lewis said this like trying to jump off your own shadow, being very self-conscious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
go
what does cinema? How does cinema help us
Yeah.
I was wondering when we were going to get back to cinema.
Let's get back to it. So, how does cinema? One of the things you talked about in your lecture was how cinema shaped Sayers' sensibilities,
Right.
Which I think is interesting because when we talk about cinema and our Wade authors, often it's more about how they've influenced it. We've got Lord of the Rings movies, and we've got the Chronicles of Narnia, and there's a new series coming out on Netflix, and they've actually influenced a lot of the cinema that we're seeing today through their storytelling. So how does cinema relate to Dorothy Sayers, and how is that important?
Okay, good question. So after I finished the third book, which is on semiotics, I wrote a book on film and religion, because the place where semiotic theory is most alive and well is in film theory. It's how do we read signs on the screen? And I saw this as very important for Christians to not just be passively watching film and not thinking about how we're being manipulated. One great example of manipulation is by camera angles, by close-ups. A film can get us to sympathize with someone who is cheating on her husband because it just shows how despicable the husband is and how needy she is. But then another film will use semiotic techniques to make us see this woman herself as despicable because she cheats. And it's the signs on the screen that manipulate us to think that way. So I intended this book, I called it Salvation from Cinema, to be about Christianity and film. And I discovered that there's a whole discourse known as religion and film, that a lot of secular universities are teaching religion by using film, partly because they're having trouble filling the courses. People aren't interested in religion anymore. So I took out a lot of the explicitly Christian stuff, although basically I'm still arguing. I use that same argument from Jacques Derrida that the only religion we should take seriously is a religion based on love, which avoids an economy of exchange. Look at this. Christianity is the only religion that does that. So in this book that's being studied at secular universities, I am basically arguing why Christianity should be taken more seriously than any other religion. So
your title of the book, Subversive, fits very well to your own strategy.
Well, and I had a lot of more explicit Christian theology left over once the other book was published. And so now I want to speak explicitly to Christians, and Sayers can help us do that because she loved cinema. And one of the things I discovered is that the person who put together the 2,000-page collected letters of Dorothy Sayers, which reaches 4 volumes, left out most of the letters praising cinema. Now, I understand why she did it. Once again, we all look at truth through our own lens. Someone once said, none of us see life the way...
None of us see things as they are. We see things as we are.
We are. And so this Sayers scholar, who I respect immensely, she was a specialist in Dante. So she included every single letter of Sayers that mentions Dante, many letters that, unless you are a Dante scholar, are going to be very rough going. But she leaves out the letters about cinema because she's not interested in cinema. And when she was collecting letters, or when she was becoming a scholar, cinema was just kind of considered...
It's like going to see a baseball game. It's just a pastime.
Cinema was just entertainment. And the editor wanted to prove that Sayers was a serious scholar, and she wanted to marginalize Sayers' interest in this questionable activity. Well, since then, cinema is a very serious object of study. People can go to universities, get degrees in cinema studies. And so we're ready now to think as Christians, how can we think intelligently about cinema, and how can Sayers guide us in that reflection?
Gotcha. So how did, what are some of the things you talked about in your lecture, and I think also that are in your article that's coming out in the upcoming volume of 7, volume 36? What are some of the things how did cinema influence Sayers, and what impact did it have on her that has been overlooked that you've
Well,
discovered
because
recently?
Sayers was so interested in cinema, she loved photography. I discovered this great insight that when she had very little money, she had just returned from a year of teaching after graduating from Oxford University. She didn't like teaching. In fact, she hated it so much. One of the things she did when she was up, and part of it is she was in a bleak town in northern England called Hull, and how she escaped a profession that just was not her gift. She went to cinema, and she would write home talking about these great movies she saw. And
I'm living in Hull, she probably said. This place is a living hall.
so she left Hull behind, and
Apologies to people who live in Hull.
yes, and went to. Oh, I'm sure it's much more lovely today than
sure
it
it
was
is.
back
This
then.
place is a real Hull.
David.
The semiotics of Hull have changed for the better.
So she went back to Oxford, and she just loved her time in Oxford. But now she didn't have a source of income. But despite that, she wanted her photograph taken by a real artist. So she spent the money to go to London to have her picture taken by a woman the same age as Sayers, who had just opened a studio. Her name was Wilding, and she became famous after Sayers recognized her abilities and for doing photographs of celebrities and the royal family.
Oh, wow.
So if you have seen the series The Crown on Netflix, which is just brilliantly done, both in the teleplay writing and the cinematography.
The sets and everything.
The visual images are based on this woman that Sayers recognized as an artist. Sayers recognized her as an artist before anybody else did. So she had a real eye for the visual constitution of what you see in a photograph, which is key.
It's a visual
to cinema.
language. It's a language in and of itself.
Yeah. Visual signs, which are, and any film theorist will tell you, the visual signs are more important than the verbal signs in cinema. And Sayers was sensitive to that. She tried her hand at screenwriting. It went nowhere, mainly because she had gotten a job in France, and which was the place where cinema became an art form. The trouble is, the Great War devastated the French cinema industry. And after that is when Hollywood started being the center of of intelligent filmmaking. So Sayers couldn't get any of her screenplays made into films, and she actually became a detective fiction novelist just because, as she says it in one of her letters, that's where the money is. It's not because she just loved detective fiction. That's where the money was. She would have preferred doing screenwriting. And, of course, she became famous as the creator of Lord Peter Wimsey. And then she had her final opportunity to get into filmmaking when in 1935, she was asked to write a short story that would be made into talkie, as they were called, in 35. She wrote the story. When she got the screenplay, she was appalled at how poorly done the screenplay was.
Oh, wow.
And so she volunteered to work on it for no money, to make it high quality. She was committed. I mean, she loved cinema.
Yeah.
She wrote her friends, again, unpublished letters. She would talk about camera angles. And the film company, which was called Phoenix Films, totally ignored her. It was just angered her incredibly that she had no control And it wasn't long after this experience of just shoddy filmmaking that Sayers was asked to do a play for the Canterbury Festival. And she made that play about the quality, the importance of good craftsmanship. That an artist has to pay attention to craft. And what I argue is that this was the focus of that play because of her experience with poor craft in cinema,
I
in
think you
Phoenix
explained
films.
in your talk, didn't you? They were called quota quickies.
Right.
Because they had to come up with a certain amount of native-born British cinema. And
Right.
so even the director who made the film later on wrote in
Said
his
they were
biography.
awful
Yeah, he says,
films.
weren't they awful?
They were just done because Britain told America a certain percentage of films shown in Britain had to be made by Brits. And so American companies helped fund these second-rate films. So that's where the idea of a B film came from. They were the second film shown.
Is B for British? Is that what you're saying? A is for American? And no, I don't think
I don't think so.
Isn't that like
But-
records? You have the B side of the record, which is the less
Yeah.
popular
Yeah.
music.
So you have a blockbuster film, and then you have the
The
B
main-
film
yeah, or the
that they
main
would pay.
attraction,
And so they weren't meant to be good films. Sayers, of course, didn't know about quota quickies when she was asked to write this this short story, and a lot of people didn't. That people were just churning out films, and sure enough, once the law for quota quickies was changed, this, like many film companies in England, went out of business
Oh, wow.
because they weren't there to make quality
Yeah.
cinema.
And after Gone with the Wind, the B feature will be Gone with the Whimsy. Is that what happened? What was the actual title of the movie that they made of
The
her?
Silent Passenger.
Oh, The Silent
And it's
Passenger.
just just the cheesiest depiction of Lord Peter Wimsey. He looks like a bumbling, semi demented, aging sleuth. It is. It's really, really bad.
Well, it is kind of interesting because film is very collaborative. If you're an author who writes a book, you have a lot of control over the final product.
Yeah.
But if you write a screenplay, a lot of people are going to have their hands on that before it becomes a final product. But ironically, she liked drama, which is also very collaborative. Why would she have such a bad experience in the film industry and such a good experience in helping produce and write and put up plays?
Well, the theater she helped produce wasn't professional theater. It was theater that was commissioned to be put on in churches and to celebrate Christian topics. So
it's
they
not money
welcome,
driven.
yes,
But
right.
also,
It's
you're
not
a lot more
money.
hands-on.
I think there's also a difference between theater's approach to a script and
Oh,
film's
definitely.
approach to a script. I think a lot of scripts that are written for films or screenplays are, they're seen as like this is a starting point, but it's
Right.
it's flexible.
Right.
Whereas in the theater, there's a devotion to the printed words and communicating them, and there's a freedom in how you say it and blocking and those kinds of things. But nobody's rewriting Shakespeare all the time. When you pull out Hamlet, it's the words on the page. And I think
Right.
there's a
The playwright is the most honored
yeah
part of the collaboration in theater.
yeah
That is not true in cinema, where the director is considered having hegemony over what appears on the screen.
Well, the
now,
director
there are
and
certain directors
editor.
who value their screenwriters,
yeah
but we have, or David has, a former student from out in California where he would come in, he would be hired to be a script doctor, and he would revise a script so that 70% 90% of it was his words, but he didn't get any credit. So it's just more. It is collaborative, but it's a very different collaboration.
Yeah.
Theater collaboration is how do we best put up this script?
Yeah.
Whereas film collaboration, and film is so much more expensive than theater. So it often, a good screenplay can just be eviscerated in order to appeal to a mass audience.
On that percentage, I think my students said you're only allowed to script doctor up to 49%.
Oh, okay.
Or else then you get a screen credit. So they would stop him at a certain point because they just wanted to give him money for fixing it, not give him a screen credit.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, also
But
she
then
was very
others where he did do the screenplay and got credit, they changed it so much that he was embarrassed that his name was up there.
Right. But another thing about Dorothy that's interesting is she was so hands-on. She would help with sets and sew costumes.
Right.
So she wasn't sitting there on a big high chair directing people to do things.
Right.
And didn't she even consider a drama troupe to be a kind of image of the church?
Yes.
Here's this community that we're all trying to accomplish one thing.
Right.
Yeah, we talked about that with Christine Colon on the podcast
Right.
about her recent book about choosing community. So, yeah, if you want to learn more about that, you can go listen to that.
Oh,
episode.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Where Sayers said that theater has all the stigmata of an effective church.
Right. What weird word, stigmata.
Yeah. But markings, signs, it goes back to signs.
So, Crystal, to wrap up, how can you've talked about how cinema influenced Sayers. How do you think that Christians moving forward can make good cinema or use the language, the semiotics of cinema to communicate things like the gospel and these signs of truth that more people are turning to movies and binging TV shows on Netflix and things like that.
Right.
How can we use that medium as a positive force for communicating?
Well, this is something that I want to write about in my book on Sayers and cinema, which David gave the title to The Wages of Cinema, which I like. But I have a whole chapter in my subversive book coming out that addresses this very issue, because Sayers did not advocate writing books, writing plays, or making movies in order to propagandize people.
Oh.
And if your goal is evangelism, she believed it would lead to poor craft, and it would be an embarrassment to Christianity. And I think there are movies that have been made for evangelism purposes that are just embarrassing to watch because they get so caught up in the message that they ignore the medium. Sayers uses the word medium over and over and over again in her writing. She is aware of the power of medium, whether the medium is theater, whether it's short story, whether it's cinema, whether it is novel. So,
can I give an example of that?
Yeah.
When I was at Boulder, back in the day, students were cutting paths across the green areas, and they had these big black and white signs that said, "Keep off the grass." And back then, everybody was anti-establishment, and if it said "keep off the grass," that made students want to cross the grass. About a month into the semester, they changed it to green and white signs that said, "Give Earth a chance, please use sidewalks."
Yeah.
So it's the same message. And within a month, those shortcuts started to disappear because people responded to the exact same message, but when the medium was more attractive and drew upon the values they agreed with, they were able to accept that message.
Right.
So that would be an example of, I think, of trying to find a way to choose the medium which conveys the message to that audience.
Right. So a great way to end this podcast would be to quote Sayers' important statement, which applies to cinema as well as to all the work any Christian does. And she says this in an essay called Why Work? The only Christian work is good work well done.
Well, we will have to wait for your forthcoming book on Sayers, and those that are interested can watch your inaugural lecture on our YouTube channel. You can search for the Wade Center on YouTube and find our videos. There's Crystal's inaugural lecture and even David's, which we're going to do on a podcast coming up about Tolkien and Lewis and dragons or something like that. David?
Mm-hmm. When is a dragon more than a dragon?
Yeah, so we'll
is
talk
my
about
title.
that coming up. Those are also, like I said, available on our YouTube channel. And then also Crystal's article, her inaugural lecture in article form, is coming out in 7, so stay tuned for that. And thank you guys for letting me join in on the conversation today.
And Crystal, thank you for your good interview. Well done. And don't be a stranger. Go ahead and come see us here at the Wade Center.
You're always
like
welcome in your own office.
Thank you so much, Crystal, and thank you so much, Aaron.